Hello, I'm going to record my work on my BMW Z3 Roadster, year 2002. It's a 3.0i. And now that I'm locked in my house because of the plague, I've decided to take on a project that I've been planning for quite some time. And that is replacing the oil pan gasket, the engine mounts, and a few other sundry things. Talk to any BMW mechanic and he'll tell you that there are three things that pretty much all BMWs suffer from as far as oil leaks. And that is valve cover gasket right here, the oil filter housing gasket, and the oil pan. And I've already taken care of the valve cover gasket twice on this car, the oil filter housing gasket on this car, and on my wife's 328i. So the only thing left on this one, at least, is the oil pan gasket, and that's what we're going to do today. And in the process, I'm going to add a little happy homemaker tips. Here are some of the tools that I think I'll be finding essential. One, obviously, a service manual where I can be getting the torque specs. A impact wrench and a side impact. Well, this isn't really an impact wrench, but it's an electric wrench. And some plastic paper bags. I'll be putting the different bolts and stuff into the paper bags, labeling them. Later on, I'll figure out what torque is used to replace the bolts, and I'll write that on the bags, making the installation a little bit easier. And another thing I'm going to be using is this composite book. This is something really handy, and I've done this with every single car I've ever owned. And I keep a log of all the repairs I've ever done. And it's made the difference when I go to sell the car. And also notes, such as, for instance, how does a serpentine belt go back onto the car? Very useful. And I really recommend doing something like this. The logbook tells me that it's been about 3 or 4 years since I've replaced the serpentine belts. So that's one thing I'm going to do. If you take the belts off your car and you're not replacing them, something you might want to consider doing is getting a white Sharpie, making a little mark on the fan belt so that when you take it off the car, you don't put it back on the car in the reverse direction. That'll tend to wear the belts out faster. If you are replacing the belts, and the belts still look marginal, don't throw them away. Put them in the trunk of the car. That way, if you're ever out in the lonely desert, I-15 on the way to Vegas or something, and you break a fan belt, well, you know how to replace it because you just did it. And you got the spare one in the trunk of your car, and you'll get back to civilization. It'll save your ass someday. Before I jack the car up, I'm going to take advantage of a few things that are more easily accessible when the car is at floor level. And I'm going to be taking off the fan housing, fan belts, the air intake box, mass airflow sensor, and the dipstick. These are the tools I'm going to use to take off the fan. Remember that the fan is counter-threaded. In other words, it's not righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. It's the opposite. So I'll do that. Homemaker hint. Harbor Freight gets these little magnetic trays in, and get a big one and a lot of little ones, and then you put the sockets that you're using into the tray, and you don't end up them being on the floor and you kick them underneath the tire as you're working underneath the car. Makes things really easy. Air cleaner box is now off, and the fan belts and serpentine belts are off. The tension tensioner pulley for this one takes a T25. And then this one takes, I think, a 16 millimeter. This is the other tensioner for the big serpentine belt. And next step is to remove the dipstick guide tube, which requires a 10 millimeter bolt right there, and also to take off the power steering pump, which is 2 bolts up here and then 1 bolt underneath, but I have to jack the car up to get to the one underneath, so that'll do it the next step. All right, the power steering pump taken off, only 2 bolts suspended now with a bungee cord, so it's up and out of the way. The dipstick pulled out from its hole. That is a pain in the neck. That's a 13 millimeter, and you have to pull it out of this hole right there. That takes some muscle, and that takes some finagling. Allow plenty of time for that. Then car jack up underneath the oil pan to push the engine up just a little bit so that we can put this brace, the engine brace, across it. Push it up about 3/4 of an inch maybe, then tighten this down to suspend the engine and take pressure off the subframe. Here's the oil pan off the car, and let me give you a little bit of strategy as far as this goes. All these holes, obviously these are the 21 of that size bolt, followed by 2 really long bolts. One goes here and the other one on the other side here. Here's where the transmission bolts in, and there's 2 holes, access ports in the transmission. That's where these medium-sized bolts go in, followed by the Torx bolts here, here, and here. Now, when you take the subframe underneath the car off, you see all these bolts exposed, and the temptation is to immediately start taking those off first. But actually, that's not really the best strategy, as I've discovered. What you should do is go for the hard bolts first, take those out, and then go through the majority of these 21 small bolts. Leave just 2, pick 2 on both sides, or one on one side, one on the other side, that are easily accessible, and maybe break them loose, but let them remain until you've gotten all the other bolts off, especially the difficult ones. Then finally, when everything is all done, then you can take off the 2 final easily accessible bolts, and then the oil pan is yours. Just a word of warning. On this side, on the driver's side, there are 4 bolts, well, actually 3 bolts, that are extremely difficult to get to. You're going to try and want to get at them with your socket, ain't going to work. This one, use a 10 millimeter box end. This one, you got to just kind of work at it. You might be able to get the 10 millimeter box end on it too. This one, using a universal swivel or a wobbly swivel on your socket to get to that one. Once you've cleaned up the oil pan, or while you're cleaning up the oil pan, soak the bolts in paint thinner or mineral spirits to clean all the grease and grime and gunk and grit off of them, because putting them back on is a lot easier if you've got nice, clean, crisp threads. My first day working on this was completely consumed with taking on taking off everything up to, but not including the subframe. Second day, I spent taking off the subframe and the bolts holding the oil pan to the engine. Today I'm on my third day, and then I'm just going to spend doing nothing but cleaning up. Oh, by the way, notice I have the engine mounts already hanging, the new engine mounts hanging on the engine brackets. My reason for that is thinking that it's easier to get the bolts onto the subframe than in the blind, rather than having the engine mounts attached to the subframe and trying to get them onto the engine. So put them on the engine first, just let them hang free, and then you can put the subframe back on. And I think that would go a lot easier. Talk about torque wrenches. I have 3 because this one is for upper range things, like, for instance, the axle, an axle nut, or torquing down the lug nuts for the wheel. This one is medium range, and this one is scaled in inch pounds, which I'm going to use against the oil pan, because the oil pan is 7 foot-pounds, which is 84 inch-pounds, which is a nice mid-range for this one. When you're dealing with the bolts themselves, notice how I've put down the torque spec for, like, subframe mounting bolts. By the way, the part number for the subframe mounting bolts are 3111-6781023. The bushing carrier bolts, 31 foot-pounds. Here's the part number for this. Engine mount, 31 foot-pounds. I didn't give you the part number. You can look that up on Amazon. That's where I bought it. Sway bar nuts. No idea what the foot-pound is on that. An interesting idea, since you have like 26 bolts holding down or holding up the oil pan to the engine, get a nice colorful Sharpie pen, and as you torque down each one, put a little bright hash mark onto the bolt itself, or if you can't get to the bolt, right next to it. Saves you time later on, and saves your peace of mind as you're thinking, did I really torque them all down? Are there any that I missed? Well, you'll have a visual confirmation that you've done your job. And that completes it. Now, I didn't show every little detail because there are a lot of other videos, like, for instance, that hat tip to 50s Kid, that's 50KIDS, who's got excellent videos. Their quality is really good, the lighting is really good. I believe the author of that channel is a guy named Jason, and he tells you what he's going to do, why he's going to do it, shows when things go wrong. And I couldn't beat his videos, so I didn't even try. So I just thought I'd create a video that kind of had my little shortcuts and tricks and observations on this project. I think, ironically, one of the most difficult parts of this that caused me the most consternation was the dipstick. On this car, there's, oh, I can't even show you now. There's a holder, a bracket that screws into the side of the engine, and getting that 13 millimeter bolt on is a chore. Very difficult. Getting it off also was very difficult, and that took me the most amount of time. Also, there were some other bolts that were being stubborn. My idea of using a Sharpie didn't really work. I couldn't see enough contrast because the bolts holding the oil pan are black. So you might want to try getting a little bit of white paint, but I think it's well worth it. I tried everything. It didn't. I couldn't develop a mark that was significantly contrasted to the black of the bolts. This project I started on a Thursday and finished today on a Wednesday. And one thing that I did is I stopped when I started getting really tired, because I figured because I'm locked in because of the plague. This is spring of 2002, April of 2000. I'm sorry, not 2000, 2020, and I have all the time in the world to do this. So I figured I'm going to take my time and I'm going to be thorough. And if I get tired, I'm going to stop, because I know that when you get tired, you start skipping steps. And when you skip steps or get lazy, that's when you start snapping heads off bolts. So work until you're going, oh, my arms are tired. Then stop for the day. If you're a professional mechanic, that may not be something you can do. But if you're a DIYer and you allow yourself enough time for that luxury. Anyway, the project is done. So far, it's not leaking, and that's it. Thanks for watching.